They've finally done it. Low Fuel Motorsports has introduced a structured league with proper matchmaking for the original Assetto Corsa. This is a free league. It allows mods. It uses community-created content. I'm not associated with LFM, and this isn't sponsored content. I just think it's cool. Everything is accessed through the website, which you're looking at here. The race structure is similar to iRacing, including driver's license, a skill rating or ELO, a safety rating. Pre-registration for races occurs like hours in advance, so heads up on that. And the time slots tend to lean towards European time zones. There's already lots of great videos out there on how to sign up for LFM and get into your first race, so I'm not going to talk about that. But what I do want to talk about is using LFM replays to actually benchmark CPUs. And I've got 8 CPUs lined up for that. But before we can get into that detail, because most of you might be new to LFM, I want to show you a little bit of the content that's required to get started. It is required for all participants of LFM to use the Content Manager application for Assetto Corsa, seen here floating somewhere in space and time. If you open this thing up, you're going to be able to access a whole bunch of different things, including all of the settings that would otherwise be within the Assetto Corsa simulator. Your video settings, audio, controls, etc., etc. It's all here. Another cool thing it has is this shader patch, and I uninstalled it and we'll reinstall it for you here. I recommend using this thing because it's going to get you even more visual features that you can tweak in other settings, but also performance goes up. And based on that alone, I recommend installing it. You can pick the recommended version, which I guess is the most stable, or the most recent version, which is what I opted for. Built within Assetto Corsa is a benchmark that I believe shipped with the original release of the simulator. You can find it under the bottom here within the settings for video. It's going to launch a benchmark that is basically using the settings that you have selected. And it seems like it's a neat feature, but it's not a complex race and it doesn't stress the computer enough. So the FPS it's going to report to you will be much higher than what you actually experience in the race. Also, I mean, just looking at the inputs from the AI, I could not tolerate watching this hundreds of times for my benchmark run, so I had to come up with my own. I'm using 2 replays of the LFM races that I participated in last week. The first is Hockenheim with 25 grid spots for the Mazda MX-5. This represents performance you'll see in single manufacturer series around a typical racetrack. I only collected data for the first lap because that's still the most intense on computer systems. The second replay is the Green Hell Cup with a mix of GT cars and 70 grid slots. This was a bottom split during the testing week. It was my first race on LFM and I started 60th, so this is carnage. This also represents the most intense CPU situation that I've recorded so far. Here's the FPS comparison between the internal benchmark, which I don't recommend, with the Green Hell replay that I have here. There is a massive difference. When you select a series to sign up for, you'll see all the required applications and content above the server listing. One thing that I disagree with in this list is the recommendation to use Sol. That's a nifty mod that adds dynamic weather and loads of interesting effects and processing filters. The problem is that it no longer receives development updates from its creator, who also admits a flaw in Sol's design that creates memory leaks, and that causes microstutters. In my benchmarking with Sol, I saw inconsistent data and unusual results. Now, the creator has taken all of his knowledge and rebuilt the mod under a different name called Pure. This corrects the previous design issues. However, it's receiving too many updates right now. That's a good thing for Pure users, but for benchmarking, I'm always trying to reduce the variables that can influence data results. So when Pure stabilizes in the future, I'll revisit it. Here's a quick glance at the settings that I'm using with Assetto Corsa. I would call these like normal to high, I suppose. I mean, the sim is what, 10 years old now, so you should be able to push it a little bit. I did disable a lot of these lateral G-force effects and things that move the cockpit around. I find that very distracting just for my own driving sake. And when it comes to this CSP, I have the weather on default. Now, this is where you would see Pure or Soul over here. And all these other extensions, I've left them default. So if that's a mistake, please tell me in the comments because that's what I did. Here are the 8 processors I'll be testing with the Assetto Corsa. This chart remains the same as last time because I didn't notice any significant changes in the clock speeds during testing, and the pricing is about the same. I mean, generally speaking, the Newegg prices have jumped up a little bit over the last couple weeks. The 3 top-end processors are the 13700K, which performs the same as a 14700K. Then there's the 7800X3D and the 5800X3D from AMD with that X3D V-Cache. The next 3 processors represent the least expensive models I recommend on the respective Intel and AMD platforms. And at the bottom, we have the 2 legacy processors. The remaining parts are listed here for those that are interested in those details. And I'm still using the GeForce RTX 3080 Ti for testing. This model is still selling on eBay for about $600 US, which is the same launch price as the new RTX 4070 Super coming out this week. I suspect they will perform very similar. However, the Super should be more power efficient. As the engines fire up for the replay above, here are some quick little notes. I'm only doing the first lap for the benchmark because that's when you're surrounded by the most cars and the closest distance. Replays work great for Assetto Corsa benchmarking because they are consistent and representative of real-time performance. The lowest resolution I tested was single screen 1440p. These results will be very similar to 1080p and ultra-wide resolutions like 3440 by 1440. The top 5 processors are able to deliver over 300 frames per second. The 13700K leads the chart, but the 5800X3D delivers nearly identical performance. It's interesting to see the other AM4 and AM5 processors trail behind the 5800X3D, about 9% slower. The 12600K also seems to struggle here, lagging behind the 13700K by 23%. Here is the GPU busy chart. Each bar represents the percentage of time the GPU was busy during the creation of each individual frame. And this is presented here as an average over all frames during the 143 seconds of the benchmark. Even at this resolution, the top 4 processors can push the 3080 to the max. There's a clear correlation between the chart and the previous FPS results. The bottom 3 were unable to achieve 300 FPS because they were unable to leverage the extra ability of the video card. So in the case of the 12600K, 82% of the time it had completed its work during the frame generation, meaning 18% was left idle. Instead of looking at the 4K results for Hockenheim, let's stay at the same resolution, 1440p, and switch to the Nordschleife results. This race scenario is significantly more demanding on the CPU, and right away we see the 7800X3D stretch out a significant lead. It's 14% faster than second place 5800X3D, and a whopping 35% faster than the 13700K. Clearly, the 3D V-Cache is an advantage for the first lap around the green hell. AMD's 7600X has also closed the gap to the 13700K. It's just 3% behind. But if your goal is to obtain smooth racing on a 1440 monitor with FreeSync or G-Sync enabled, even a 9700K is up to the task, averaging 143 FPS in this benchmark. Looking at the GPU busy chart, only the 7800X3D is able to get the most out of the video card. In this intense CPU scenario, we see the 7600X get a little more out of this 3080 Ti. Perhaps that is why it's closed the gap to the 13700K. The video card has a significant amount of headroom when paired with the Ryzen 5600 and the 12600K from Intel. This suggests a slower video card like an RTX 3070 or a 2080 Ti can provide similar FPS with those two CPUs. Sticking with the green hell, but increasing the resolution to single screen 4K, the 5800X3D now leads the charts, having lost 23% of its performance from 1440p. It does show a 7.7% lead over the 13700K, but it is surprising to see the 7800X3D results. It loses 100 FPS compared to single 1440p benchmarking. That's a 30% reduction in performance. The other processors only lose a handful or a dozen FPS compared to their results at 1440p because those CPUs were already the bottleneck in this scenario. We saw in the previous GPU busy chart that there was plenty of headroom left for the 3080 Ti to tackle the more rendering required at 4K. Here's the GPU busy chart for the 4K resolution around Nordschleife, and only 2 legacy processors are unable to push the card beyond 90%. Flipping back to Hockenheim, now also at 4K, we see the top performing CPUs drop from over 300 FPS to just over 200 FPS. These FPS averages are lower than what we saw around Nordschleife at 4K. Not because this is more intense for the processors, but we're at the limits of the graphics card. While the 13700K and 5800X3D are tied again at the top, notice how the AMD AM5 chips have dropped even further down the chart. Sure, it's only an 8.5% gap between them and the top scoring 5800X3D, but it's still surprising to see AM4 beat AM5. The 7800X3D is even slightly slower than the 7600X, which only has 6 cores and lacks the 3D V-cache. But in this GPU-limited scenario, the faster clock speed from the 7600X matters more. The GPU busy chart confirms our suspicion. This Hockenheim benchmark allows almost all the CPUs to push the 3080 Ti to its full potential. Single-screen performance in Assetto Corsa with LFM does not require a beefy CPU. Once you lock in your monitor at a fixed refresh rate, maybe it's 144, all of these CPUs are capable of delivering that performance, or even some of the legacy processors. What does matter is your GPU. Now I'm testing with the 3080 Ti and it's overkill. I'm running high settings and maximum world detail. So if you can wind back some of those quality settings, I think a 3060 Ti or maybe even less is probably good enough. With 3 screens running at triple 1080p, here are the results. This time the 13700K from Intel leads the chart. The 5800X3D trails by 3.6% and performs slightly better than the entry-level Ryzen 5600. With the triple screen rendering demand, the 12600K climbs the list and beats out both Ryzen 7000 series. The 7800X3D is basically tied with the 7600X, but there is a slight advantage with the 1% lows. Both AM4 chips are able to achieve better results than their AM5 counterparts, beating them by over 9%. There's something about Assetto Corsa and the custom shader pack that doesn't play nice with the Ryzen 7000 series. Once again, all processors can provide a high FPS, and the gap from the 7800X3D to the 13700K is 14%. When we take a look at the GPU busy chart, we see high utilization. It's a little surprising to see both the 7000 series AMD chips have 95% utilization, but in the FPS results, we didn't see that become an advantage. Through my testing, the only way to get 100% GPU utilization with triple screens is to enable NVIDIA Surround, but we're going to talk about that later. So what happens if we do triple screens around the green hell? When challenged with this intense torture test around the Nordschleife, we see a much wider gap between the CPUs. The 2 AMD chips with 3D V-cache lead the charts, with the 5800X3D in front of the 7800X3D by 4%. In third place comes the 13700K with an admirable performance, showing a significant 34% gain over the 12600K. This is one of the widest gaps I've ever seen between these two processors that are sharing the same motherboard and the same memory. So this is down to the architecture and the design of those two chips. We see the legacy processor, the 9700K, struggle to deliver the frame rate we want for the first lap, but not as poorly as the Ryzen 2700, which just clears a 60 FPS average. With the racing intensifying in front of us, I'm going to try and keep your attention on the GPU busy chart here. The top 4 processors are all using over 90% of the GPU in this chart. Unlike the previous Hockenheim scenario, the Ryzen 5600 and Intel 2600K are struggling to compete the CPU workload and fail to get the most out of the 3080 Ti. So if we're going to jump up to triple 1440p, what we're going to notice, oh, hold on, this is a great rec up in front. Check this out. Whack! Oh, I love that every time. All right, so if we're going to jump up to 1440p, we know these top processors don't have much headroom with the video card, so we're going to run into some kind of GPU limit. We'll stick with this 4-minute replay of this Nordschleife race, but increasing the resolution to triple 1440p is an 80% increase in pixels compared to triple 1080. Even in this CPU intense scenario, the results are flattening out a bit more. The 13700K leads the way with 163.7 FPS. Nestled into second place is actually the 5800X3D with a small 2.4% advantage over the 7800X3D. And the 7600X is just behind at 151.3 FPS. These 4 processors are able to deliver over 144 FPS at this resolution. So if you're targeting a monitor with 144 hertz, you need to make sure your GPU is up for the task. A curious note is the Ryzen 2700, which actually gains a few FPS compared to how it performed at 1080p. I'm not sure why that's the case. I would expect it would just hold steady like the Intel 9700K, but I'm not going to dig more into this at this point. All of these current generation CPUs show a GPU busy average in the 90s. This suggests better performance can be obtained with a faster video card. Flying back over to the Mazdas around Hockenheim, but now at triple 1440p, we see only a 10% difference between the 13700K, which is leading the chart, and the 7800X3D shown towards the bottom. Once again, these averages are actually lower than the triple 1440p around Nordschleife. Perhaps these 70-odd cars are more challenging to the CPU around the Green Hell, but the buildings, grandstands, and other objects around Hockenheim are more challenging to the video card. The 7600X held a 7% advantage over the vanilla 5600 around the CPU-intense Nordschleife benchmark, but here at Hockenheim, it swung to a 5% advantage for the 5600 over the 7600X. Also notice how both the 5800X3D and the 7800X3D are beneath their cheaper non-X3D models. Sure, this is within a measurement error, but it's an indicator that the 3D V-cache will not improve your system's performance when faced with a GPU bottleneck. The GPU busy graph reveals once again a very high workload on the graphics card. The 3080 Ti is performing work during 95% of the time it takes to complete each frame handled by the CPU. But if we know we are GPU bottlenecked, why aren't we seeing 100% in this chart like we saw in the single screen benchmarks? Well, that's where NVIDIA Surround comes in. If you're not familiar with NVIDIA Surround and you Google it, you might end up at this webpage that looks like it's from 2008. A better one would be over here. This is the support page for NVIDIA Surround. And I mean, it perfectly articulates that it's for combining 2 or 3 separate screens to create a single synchronized visual canvas. This technology is especially compelling for driving and flight simulation. So that's what we're talking about. There's a whole bunch of details here about how to set it up if you're interested. When we zoom in and look at the frame time chart, comparing triple 1440p without surround to the same scenario with Surround, we see a very visual apparent difference between the two rendering approaches. Each spike represents a delayed frame, and those delays dramatically increase the 0.2% lows, and those bring down the overall FPS average. Personally, I don't notice micro stutters when driving Assetto Corsa with or without NVIDIA Surround. But if you're looking for more performance or a solution to visual hiccups and hitches, try out NVIDIA Surround if you have compatible hardware. When we look at the performance results for triple 4K using Surround, here's what we get. The bars are completely flat because FPS performance is limited to the GPU. There really isn't much to talk about here with the CPUs. The GPU busy chart looks as expected. All CPUs are waiting on the GPU to complete its workload before the frame can be presented. One last chart for the green hell, and here are the Surround 4K results using these triple screens. Intel 13700K leads the chart with its little brother 12600K claiming second, but we're looking at another really flat chart. There's about a 5% difference between the 7800X3D and the leader, as once again we're seeing the AM5 platform struggle compared to its AM4 counterpart when dealing with the GPU bottleneck. A quick glance at the GPU busy chart reveals that we mostly have hundreds, except for the two legacy processors. Another way to summarize this data is with a head-to-head comparison between CPUs. And we're going to compare kind of the entry level and mid-range and the high end. This isn't necessarily a price comparison, but it should give you an understanding of where the value might be. I've put together some head-to-head battles here, starting with entry level. We have the 5600 versus the 12600K. I think it's pretty much a clear victory for the 5600 in most resolutions. Next is the battle between AM4 and AM5. Maybe you have an existing 3300X or something on the AM4 and you're compatible for 5800X 3D, but you're wondering, should I make that investment into this now obsolete platform, or should I upgrade to the 7600X entry level into AM5? And the answer is, well, I think you should upgrade the 5800X 3D. And the last duel is at the high end between two of the top processors out there. I think the faster processors than these will present diminishing returns, and the 13700K wins. So unless you have a 4080 or a 4090, you probably want to go Intel with Assetto Corsa. All right, conclusions. This is like my 20th take at this, so we're just going to roll. First and foremost, I think the 13700K shows itself as the winner. It was in the top 3 in all the resolutions I tested, and it won half of the benchmarks. That's super impressive. The next thing is that the Hockenheim benchmark was very different from the Nordschleife benchmark. We were seeing a GPU constraint versus the Nordschleife and its very intense CPU demands. And in these scenarios, basically, if you can get a fast enough video card, most of these processors can get you that refresh rate that you want. If it's 144 or 165. If you're looking for 200 and something, I don't think that matters with sim racing. Prove me wrong. When it comes to the AM5 versus AM4, that was an interesting battle. I don't know exactly why the AM5 is underperforming. I've looked at older benchmarks that go back a couple years released by other websites that are not using an RTX 4090. And there are lots of examples in those reviews and on older titles that show the newer platform is not faster than the older platform. So this isn't unusual, but maybe you are not as familiar with that, because nowadays everyone thinks if you just remove that GPU bottleneck, you'll see the best performing CPU. And that's true, but what, 1% of us have a 4090? So I think we're missing a little bit of the story here. And what really matters is having a balanced system. And in the future, I want to do more videos that concentrate on that so that you find the best pairing between CPU and GPU. Oh, and one more thing, if you're used to iRacing or Assetto Corsa Competizione, and you're not used to modifying or using user-created tracks and cars and all that stuff, just a heads up, it affects performance because it consumes resources. I'm not going to test a whole loaded up Assetto Corsa with all those mods because I wouldn't be testing hardware as much as I would be testing inefficient code and mods that might be competing in the wrong way or incompatible with each other. So just a heads up on that. Personally, if I was competing in LFM, I would just run a baseline vanilla kind of content and make sure I have the smoothest experience. So thanks again for watching. Like and subscribe and tune in next week. I plan to have a Radeon review.